Turnchapel, 2020. When you see it from the air today, it's hard to visualise 400 years ago when, according to earliest maps, it was mainly bare land surrounded by water. Both land and sea came to play important roles in Turnchapel's development. Turnchapel has a proud maritime history. Before Devonport Dockyard was built, Turnchapel was a major site for shipbuilding and repairing in the Catwater. A cemetery discovered near Turnchapel Wharf contained human remains thought to be 17th century dock workers. Then, in the early 1800s, the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars coincided with Lord Borringdon investing in a dry dock. Ships like the 38-gun Diana were repaired here, and in 1810, from Mr. Blackburn's yard in Turnchapel, the Armada, with her 74 guns, was the largest vessel ever built in a local merchant's shipyard. Months later, another, the Clarence, was also completed, its launch captured by a lovely painting by John Rogers. In 1819, there was excitement when the whaling ship Cumberland was docked there.
When the dock at Turnchapel was opened last week for the purpose of receiving the American whaling ship Cumberland, a large shoal of fine mullets went into it and were enclosed by the gates. Sufficient water was allowed to remain in the dock to keep them alive, by which means the crew had fresh mullets every day since.
Just 10 years later, in 1831, the Beagle set off from Plymouth. On board was Charles Darwin and Assistant Surveyor Alexander Usborne. Captain Usborne later retired to Turnchapel, building a house named White Stock Villa and becoming treasurer of the Arreston and Turnchapel Steamboat Company. He even captained a local ferry called the Beagle. If the sea was important to the development of Turnchapel, then so was the land. Quarrying of stone was well established by the 19th century, and Borringdon Terrace, amongst other houses of the village, was built from those labours. The Quarryman's Arms has long gone. The reminders of quarrying remain below Tapson Drive. It was dangerous work. In 1864, quarryman John Doddridge was injured after setting charges which failed to detonate until he went to inspect them, and was blown 5 feet from a ledge. Remarkably, he survived, though he had to have his right arm amputated. Others were less fortunate, as obituaries in newspapers of the period recall. Meanwhile, up the hill from the village, Fort Stamford was being fortified. Situated on the original Civil War earthworks, by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the Sound needed greater protection from France's new iron ships. Constructed between 1862 and 1868, like other Palmerston forts, it was built on a polygonal layout with 26 cannon and a garrison of 200 men. Sea pilots came to operate from Turnchapel. Sheltered waters gave them a head start in the race to reach ships coming to the Sound. Pilot cutters had names like Surprise and Leader. Turnchapel's most famous rescue occurred in 1899, when the crew of the coaster Shamrock was plucked from disaster by 5 brave pilots on their cutter Drift. The cottage, named after this boat, was where local Vic Tucker grew up.
Drift Cot had a large boathouse, hewn from the rock underneath the house, built into the steep slope running down to the sea. On high tides, Dad could row his boat into the boathouse, then up the steps into our kitchen.
As Turnchapel continued to grow in the early 19th century, so did the desire to reach the city more quickly. As a result, ferry companies began to compete for business, and there were several piers constructed to allow passengers or trippers to board, as Mike Turpett recalls.
Summer months at weekends, hundreds of people from Plymouth would catch the ferry from Phoenix Wharf to Turnchapel to walk to Bubbersand and Shellycliff beaches. At the end of the day, they would queue right back up the hill at Turnchapel, waiting to catch the ferry back to Plymouth. Uncle John Davis would stand at the gate to the landing stage and count the passengers through. Each ferry could carry about 175 people, and the Board of Trade were very strict that the number must not be exceeded.
Then, in 1897, came the building of the railway between Plymstock and Turnchapel, though the lines weren't necessarily busy. Local Georgina Roberts recalls.
Do you come from Turnchapel or who? To Plymouth to get to Edmonton Street. I used to walk the railway lines.
The now defunct swing bridge across Who Lake is still visible, as is the tunnel entrance to Turnchapel Wharf, which runs under Borringdon Terrace. This line closed in 1961. Turnchapel also boasted a number of cable ships in the early 20th century, essential to the new business of laying transatlantic communications. One such boat was the Mackie Bennett, which was historically important as it recovered the bodies of victims of the 1912 Titanic disaster.
I well remember rowing out to the Mackie Bennett, which was becoming a rusting hulk in Clovelly Bay after being sunk in 1941. It was a good place to fish with our generously weeded bottom. Occasionally Sunderland seaplanes would moor here too, and we'd row out to try and climb on their wings, though we never succeeded.
Turnchapel played an important role in world wars. You can still see the slipway constructed for American troops to embark on their journey to Normandy for the D-Day landings. While some recall phosphorus being dropped to illuminate the land, Mary Gamble, a resident of Turnchapel then, vividly remembers her experiences of when the war really came to Turnchapel on the night of the 27th of November 1940.
There was a rash of barbed wire, pillar boxes and sentry boxes. The village football field was out of bounds. When they bombed the Turnchapel oil tanks, I was screaming, "The world's on fire!" because that's what it looked like with the flames and dense smoke rising into the air. A German plane dropped 4 bombs. 2 fell harmlessly in the lake and another hit the railway line, before one hit the oil tanks. The heat was so intense it killed 3 firefighters. Others, including my dad, jumped into the water to save themselves. Both Who and Turnchapel were evacuated, and the mortuary was used to hold the bodies of the firemen killed in the blaze.
The fires raged until December the 1st. A blue plaque at the top of the village honours Aircraftman Shaw, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who was stationed at RAF Mountbatten. He was a regular member of Turnchapel Sailing Club and had his shirts ironed by a lady of the village. The village centre has been a designated conservation area for over 40 years, with the splendid Georgian Borringdon Terrace at its heart. There are 2 flourishing pubs, the Clovelly Bay and the Borringdon Arms. While fashions may have changed over the last 100 years, the main street and its buildings have scarcely altered, although the school, butchers, sweet shop, post office and Shipwrights Arms have closed to become residential dwellings. Jack Finch remembers his school days.
I began my education at the Church Infant School at Turnchapel, situated just above the landing pier for the Plymouth, Turnchapel and the Western Ferry. The school itself had 2 classrooms which could be separated by folding doors. The heating was a coke-burning bogie with 1 each area. We had outside loos, of course. It was quite a walk from Who to Turnchapel each day, including home for midday dinner with Granny Hine, as Mother was working at Court Gates Farm.
More recent films show how in 1995 the 50th anniversary of VE Day was happily commemorated, as was the millennium at a street party in 2000. Modern Turnchapel is happily still indebted to the sea. Shipbuilding may have declined, but Turnchapel Wharf is still a place for nautical businesses. The old quarries have also been given a new lease of life, with 180 houses built in Who Quarry, while others are springing up round the waterfront. Nowadays, it's still a place where villagers meet and make merry every year with its vibrant Christmas and summer music festivals. Today, in 2020, as Turnchapel celebrates Mayflower 400, we are proud of the part it continues to play in the rich history of the area.